Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Set Off Podcast. I'm your host, Grant Chachere. Um, Last Saturday was a spring game. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm also going to show you an interview I did with Carter Bryant of Power Hour LSU um, to discuss everything that happened during the spring game. Where does LSU go from here? And stuff like that. It's a really good interview. But first, let's kind of discuss the spring game a little bit before we get into the interview with Carter Bryant. So the offense performed very well. The offense, of course, had over 300 yards passing, 371 to be exact. Garrett Nussbauer went 7 for 7 with 187 yards and 2 touchdowns. Those 2 touchdowns were busted coverages. Both the receivers were wide open for both those touchdowns. As a matter of fact, the first one, the guy with the Xavier Thomas was wide open for a good bit. Garrett Nussbauer didn't see him at first for like a good second or two. But he still, but by the time Garrett Nussbauer threw it to Xavier Thomas, he was still wide open. So it was a bad day for the defensive backfield. I still think they're talented. I still think they are, but it seems like the younger guys may usurp some of the older guys. I think Sage Ryan will be victim to that. I think he might lose his spot to Deshaun McBride, who's been really impressive all spring and really looked like the best safety in that room outside of Jardine Gilbert. Major Burns, of course, moved to the star position, which is kind of more like your traditional nickelback. And he's looked pretty impressive there, but we'll see when the season starts in the fall. Caleb Jackson had a pretty good day. 14 carries for 59 yards. Oh, apologize, y'all. It's the morning, but 14 carries for 59 yards and a 32-yard touchdown run. In terms of the receivers, Xavier Thomas, of course, 2 catches for 52 yards and the 45-yard touchdown I just mentioned. Kai Preen had a catch on a 64-yard touchdown. We'll talk about him a little bit too because he made some news. And then also Kyron Lacey, 1 catch for 59 yards. Of course, that 1 catch was his 59-yard touchdown pass, which was the second of Nussmeier's touchdowns. But going back to the quarterbacks a little bit, the backup quarterback battle is still very much ongoing. It's going to continue throughout fall camp, as neither quarterback really separated themselves. AJ Swan 4 for 9 for 55 yards, and then Ricky Collins went 6 for 12 for 52 yards. So both the quarterbacks had a completion percentage of 50% or less, and no touchdowns. Ricky Collins was sacked 5 times, and as the second team defense really bullied the second team offensive line. The second team offensive line is really not that bad. She said the second team defensive line is just really good, right? Gabe Relaford, Sean Washington. There's a lot of guys with second team defensive line that are really good. That doesn't mean that the defensive line is lacking depth, including the interior defensive line. The interior defensive line is really lacking depth, which is something that LSU is going to address once we get in the spring transfer portal. But I still think the defensive line has that it factor because they are getting tutored by Bo Davis, who's one of the top defensive line coaches in the country. And you're starting to see the improvement in that specific unit, but you're still going to need depth because there really isn't, I guess you could say, legit SEC talent. I'm not saying there isn't, but you need some experience and you need guys you need at least one more starting defensive lineman to go along with Jacoby and Guillory, right? So I think that's where the defensive line is at right now. Linebackers, arguably the best unit on the defense, in my opinion. You got Harold Perkins, Greg Penn, You got the Weeks brothers coming off the bench, and then also Christian Braithwaite has found himself in a rotating type of position, as you need at least 5 or 6 linebackers, legit linebackers who have depth at that position, especially when LSU runs a lot and their base defense they only have 2 linebackers because they have the Jack, who's the kind of more the outside linebacker, and then you also have the Star, which is what Major Birds play. He's more of like a rover in a sense, which actually fits his play style well because he's not really the best coverage safety, but he's a hell of a player when you put him closer to the line. Kind of like I'd say he's kind of like the role what Greg Brooks had, where he played closer to the line. He just wreaked havoc, kind of between 5 and 10 yards, and that's where Greg Brooks was really in. That's where LSU really missed Greg Brooks last year because he was really instrumental in that role. And I think Major Burns is a hell of a replacement. But yeah, let's. Before I want to mention this too, LSU might need to find a punter. Peyton Todd was kind of inconsistent throughout the spring game. That's something that Brian Kelly mentioned. He's kind of disappointed that he wasn't more consistent in the spring game. There's only one other punter on the roster, and that's Badger Hargett. But I'm not sure if LSU really wants to move in that direction, even though he may have looked better than Peyton Todd. I think they might go in the transfer portal, or they might bring in a walk-on punter. I'm not sure how that's going to work. But that's something you need to watch out for, especially when punters are so integral to the game, just because they can control where a team starts to drive. There's a difference between starting from, let's say if you have a really good punter, right? And he's able to down the ball at the 5-yard line. That's really bad field position for the opposing team, and that benefits the defense. So it's really important that that LSU settles on a punter, because special teams has been kind of the talk of the last 2 years. Now the special teams did better last year, but there wasn't a returner, and if you don't have a really good returner, that could also affect where your offense lands. There's the difference between where your offense starts of, if you're in good field position or bad field position. I think LSU will have a lot better returners this year, as you showed. Kyle Parker, Xavier Thomas was a hell of a returner at Mississippi State, Aaron Anderson. And so I think that's very important. So I think you're going to see better field position for the LSU offense this year, but they need to figure out their punting situation, because you don't want to put this defense in a bad spot as we know, the defense was really suspect this year. The defense will be suspect at times because you're under a new defensive staff. Remember, this is the first year under a new defensive staff. The offense has been under this staff for the last 2-3 years now, so they're very familiar with that staff, unlike the defense. So it's going to take some time, especially when you have USC the first game of the year. And I think it will get a little bit easier the next few weeks because you have a little bit easier opponents. But you need to figure out that punting spot against USC, because at the moment right now, LSU's defense is still trying to figure it out. And USC's offense is always going to be very good because of the system that Lincoln Riley runs. But anyway, here's my interview with Carter Bryant of Power LSU. Enjoy, and I'll be right back. All right, guys. I'm joined here by Carter Bryant of Power Hour LSU. Carter, how's it going, my man?
Doing good, Grant. Glad to see you're a big LSU fan and a big Liverpool fan. That's what I want to talk about.
Yeah, and I was kind of hoping they would win last weekend, but of course we had the choke. I was like, okay, Arsenal, please win, just so Man City doesn't go in first place, and then they lose. I'm like, you got to be kidding me! This is it was a bad weekend. I mean, the only thing that made up for it was, LSU baseball didn't really do well, but what made up for it was the spring game, and that's why we brought on Carter to talk about it. So Carter, what were your biggest observations from the spring game?
Yeah, so I actually went to the spring game. I don't go to a lot of games, so I went there to see some people that I normally don't get to see. And my biggest observation is Bryce Underwood is locked in. I was able to interview him and do and hang out with his dad for a little bit. So that made me feel a lot better about things, about the future of the program, because the most important thing that happens at the LSU spring game does not happen on the field at all. It is a glorified recruiting, get together, crawfish boil, hangout kind of thing. And look, I didn't get into doing college football YouTube for that. Like, I actually like the games. I really do. But you have to factor in that is the most important thing. And Brian Kelly's saying, I'm just glad nobody got hurt, and nobody did get hurt. And the recruiting and the level of players that were there, and what I'm hearing about the transfer portal, things are going well. And obviously what happened on the field is also very interesting as well, Grant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I'm glad you mentioned about the spring game. It's pretty much a showcase for recruiting to see the campus, to see the facilities, but then also to see what a game day atmosphere is kind of like at LSU, even though it's not really a game. It's kind of more of a glorified scrimmage per se. But I think it's a very important day for LSU just in terms of recruiting. And the they didn't have them there this year, but the last 2 years they had both Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase there, basically recruiting for LSU. I think that was, and then Bryce Underwood actually last year, if you don't remember, he actually took a picture with not only Joe Burrow but Jane Daniels, and so I think that's when the rumors started saying, well, Bryce Underwood's number one is LSU, and eventually it became the number one as he committed on January 6th. So I think it's a very important day for LSU, not only for the development of the players for next year's squad, but then also the recruiting aspect.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No.
Okay, cool. So I think the biggest takeaway, my opinion, was Nussmeier's performance. Nussmeier, 7 for 7, 187 yards and 2 touchdowns. I know the defense didn't look that great on Saturday, but I think what that showed is that for the first time in a really long time, LSU is starting to build consistency at the quarterback position. So what are your biggest takeaways from Nussmeier's performance? But not only that, the quarterback room as a whole, as you also have the battle for the number 2 spot, and then also Colin Hurley.
Yeah, so we'll start from back to front. I thought Colin did some really good things. Once again, it was with the deeper backups, and that obviously helped out. But very excited about Colin's future, and he looked very poised. And obviously, you go to a lot of the practices. When you're the fourth guy, you don't get as many reps, right? LSU likes to do things in groups of threes when they go through their individual portions of practice and their team portions of practice. So that's definitely really cool to see. Also, the backup battle, I think A.J. Swan did some good things. Thought he had some good ball location at times, and he looked like a quarterback like he was at Vanderbilt, a somewhat limited but very decent thrower and poised thrower of the football. And Ricky Collins, obviously, as a backup, gives you something that A.J. Swan does not give you, and that's the dual threat ability. And normally, if it's close between two quarterbacks and their numbers of the actual spring game portion of the game, they were near identical. They're around 50% passing yards, no INTs. But Ricky gives you the ability to run, and that's why I would roll with him as the top backup. But ultimately, you're right. Garrett Nussmeier looked really good. And this was important because behind closed doors and in some open portions of practice, you had seen some interceptions from Sadron and whatnot. And in this game, you saw Garrett put the ball where it needed to be. Now, the touchdown throws are wide open throws that were more so coverage bust, if anything like that. But to me, he did put a really good ball to Mason Taylor on his upfield shoulder, which then led to a touchdown throw. So those things were obviously very good to see from Garrett Nussmeier's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a pretty big day for Garrett Nussmeier. I think it kind of solidified himself as the number one quarterback, but more importantly, it showed that he was very comfortable being that guy. And I think everyone needed to see that, especially you're the guy that's replacing arguably the most dynamic quarterback in LSU history. I mean, I think even more so than Joe Burrow, just given his skill sets of running the ball. I mean, he led the team with rushing last year, and he had over 1,000 yards of rushing. I think really put the team behind his back. And if without Jane Daniels, I don't think they win 10 games. I don't think they even get close to 8 or 9. I mean, given the fact of how bad that defense was. And kind of segue into the defense, I thought they had some good moments. I think the front seven looked great as well. Looked great. Gabe Rutherford and Sean Washington looked fantastic. So did Harold Perkins. But I think a big issue was the DBs. There was a lot of coverage bust. It seemed like there wasn't a whole lot of chemistry going on. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that this is the first year under a brand new staff. The offense has been under the staff for 3 or 4 years now, but the defense is a brand new staff. How worried are you about this defensive backfield moving forward, despite you having these young guys coming in and it's showing promise?
Yeah, so I'll push back just a little bit. I thought the LSU front defensively, like you said, had some good moments, and Gabriel Rutherford is definitely one of those guys. I still feel, even though they did a good job stopping the run, just seeing in person, they obviously need to get deeper in that front seven, in particular at the DT position. Now, they did a lot better than what I thought, considering that I felt going into the game that they were just going to get run over. I mean, they held up some, but obviously defenses are oftentimes built back to front and right up the middle. And LSU right now has some concerns with that. And the secondary, you are right. You're right on the money, Grant. What really concerned me about both of Garrett Nussmeier's deep touchdown passes is it wasn't just the fact that one person was open. It was actually 2 people open on both of the plays. And that shows that there is some communication issues. If that happens one time in a spring game, sure, I can live with it. But twice where 2 different guys are wide open is tough. You would never really see that with the Eric Reed secondaries or the John Battle secondary. So, that's just a bare minimum thing. Like, you don't have to be, the next Jamal Adams to be in the right spot. And that was a big concern for me. But like you said, a bunch of new coaches in, and let's give this group some time to develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm pretty excited about the secondary. There's a lot of young guys. I like PJ Woodland a lot. I think he'll be one of the starting corners along with Zy Alexander when he comes back from his knee injury. Deshaun McBride, I think, might be another guy who could start. I think he's a guy who could usurp Sage Ryan, just given how he's looked throughout the spring. And also he had his moments during the spring game as well. But going back to the defensive line, I feel like they had their moments, but like you said, that you could tell that, they're not that deep. But given how they performed a little bit, given the guys they had, I thought they did a pretty good job. And then also you have Dominic McKinley coming in. But is there any there is a transfer that's coming. His name is Gio Paez. What have you seen from his film, how he can contribute to this LSU team, given that he's the only transfer that we know that's in fact coming into LSU?
Yeah, I think they'll be getting someone else pretty soon. But I think Gio did some really good things at Wisconsin. He had to play a couple of different roles. So I like the fact that he's played with multiple defensive coordinators. His grades were very similar to that of Jacoby and Guillory, and his tape actually, showed that he's solid. Like, he's not – I don't know if I would say he is an SEC level starter player, but he is a very good rotational piece. And I think that's the main problem right now is I don't know if there is an SEC caliber starter at defensive tackle. Jacoby and Guillory for me is – right on the fringe of that. I think I could live with him being, one of the full-time starters there. But one thing, Grant, that's very important to note, last year they had like pretty decent defensive tackle depth with 3 guys that will probably get drafted or UDFA'd. But before that, they struggled with it, right? It was a lot of heavy rotations with Mekhi Wingo and Jaquelian Roy. So that's what concerns me. This has been a position that has been relatively thin since the Aranda tight front days. So they not only have to get, a portal guy to come in, like you said, you just got to cross your fingers and hope that a Dominic McKinley can give you something right from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly. And, given the defensive line, I think one of the biggest issues with the defensive line was the fact that it just seemed like it was a rotating door defensive lineman. I mean, last year they had 3 different defensive line coaches, and one of them left for accept a role with the Broncos. Another one left to become the defensive line coach at Tulane, and then another coach had some health issues before the year, so he's out for the year. And then John Jancic had to become the defensive line coach, and he was kind of experienced with that. And then they had to bring in Pete Jenkins, so it was just a mess. But now you bring in Bo Davis, who is arguably the most probably the best defensive line coach regardless of level. I mean, he's coached in both the collegiate level and at the pro level. Yeah. How much does him being at LSU help, the Tigers, especially given that they're so thin right now with the guys they've had, but then also bringing in some of those portal guys?
Yeah, I would hope it fixes it. I mean, if Devondre Sweat didn't get in trouble off the field, I mean, he might have had the 2 first defensive tackles off the board. I think Murphy is the best defensive tackle in this year's NFL draft, and he coached him. And I think Sweat is the best plus 320 space eater in the draft before he got in trouble. And those guys were not the absolute most coveted guys. And, Bo helped mold them into being really good players. So now he's at LSU. He wants to make it work, and hopefully he can. And it was good seeing him, kick it with some of the former LSU DTs. I saw a photo with him with Marlon Favorite. So that was pretty awesome to see, and hopefully he crushes it this year.
Mm-hmm. And, I think, do you think that because of him being there, do you think somebody like a Jacoby Guillory will benefit from that? Because we've seen that Jacoby Guillory has potential, but we really haven't seen what he could really do. And I think that Bo Davis could really get that out of him.
Yeah, I'm cheering for Jacoby. Now, I know his father. His father actually stopped me at the spring game. Had a great conversation with him. And, I hope so. He's been the leader of the group. He's been through all of these different defensive line coaches. So you mentioned Jamar Cain a minute ago. He was a big leader in that room, and it's going to take that. I think there was a piece of LSU that was just hoping that Mason Smith would come back, and you would feel a lot better about the defensive tackle room, but that's just didn't happen. And now you just got to hope. And obviously one thing that makes their life a little bit more difficult than when LSU goes through this evaluation process is it the defensive tackles being as bad as they are, or is it the offensive line for LSU being as good as they are, the first team offensive line? So maybe this defensive tackle room isn't as bad because they're going up against such great players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of the offensive line, obviously this is the most talented that this group probably LSU's ever had. You have 2 first-round caliber tackles with Will Campbell and Emory Jones, and Will Campbell might be the first tackle taken off the board in next year's draft. And then you also bring back Dellinger and Frazier, and then J.J. Chester has really impressed the coach. As a matter of fact, last season against Mizzou, he actually came off the bench. Charles Turner was hurt. They brought in Marlon Martinez. He was struggling, so they put in DJ Chester. Yeah. And DJ Chester was a big part of the LSU's comeback against Mizzou. And I think that's what really started the coaches were like, maybe this guy's the future. So do you think that this unit that LSU's had, given the past units LSU's had with, in the early 2000s and some parts of the 90s, do you think that this is the greatest offensive line unit in LSU football history?
Yeah, so I'm mostly focused on modern era guys. So I can't speak to the Moai offensive lines, but I would put them number one. I think they have the potential to be that. Obviously, the most underrated group to me was the 07 group. That was such a great group, led by Brett Helms. And then the 11 group was obviously great with Will Blackwell and those guys. But you're right. I mean, this group has a really good shot of being the absolute best. And one thing that's going to be very key is, can they find a 6th guy who's going to be that first guy coming off the bench? And I am not sure if someone has emerged, right? What makes this offensive line very interesting is move around and play different roles if somebody were to go down. And Lance Hurd was always the top guy off the bench. So if a guard went down, Emory Jones would just play that guard position and they would put Lance Hurd in. So who is that number 6 guy going to be? It should be a very interesting battle. And you really you don't just need 6, you need about 7 or 8 that you could trust to give you some big minutes.
Right, and I've seen the guy. I remember when Emory Jones went down. The 2 guys that LSU brought in were Tyree Adams, and then let me see. Yeah, it was Tyree Adams, and then it was Bo Bordelon.
Bo Bordelon, yeah.
And so those are the guys they brought in. I think Tyree Adams went a little more than Bo Bordelon did, but those were the 6 or 7 guys they brought in when Emory Jones went out. And they actually impressed the coaches too. So so that kind of answers your question about the 6, 7 guys. So I think, but that also goes back to Brad Davis and his development of this whole line. And given the fact that his first year there which was the last year of Coach O's tenure at LSU, I mean, that O-line was just bad, right? And you could tell that, and they got better as the season went on, but you could tell that it clearly lacked the development or even just the talent that Brad Davis really wanted. And then the next year they brought in a bunch of guys, and that offensive line became one of the best in the country. Yeah. But I think the offensive line would play a huge part in this rushing attack that LSU trying to install. I mean, you lose Jane Daniels, and you need to have some sort of rushing attack if you really want this offense to flow. And I think that right now the top guy that's really emerged has been Caleb Jackson. I think he'll share reps with Josh Williams, given the fact that Josh Williams is a fantastic pass pro guy, and he's also been there for 6 years. But what impressed you about Caleb Jackson's performance at the spring game?
Yeah, Caleb did some really good things. Obviously, he had the deep run, and there's always room for improvement with him. And I honestly thought Josh didn't have the big breakaway touchdown, but Josh did some really good things, like you mentioned, in pass protection. Picked up a really nice blitz from Harold Perkins, and I always say this on my channel. It's crazy to see that Josh Williams was on the field for the Marco Wilson shoot throw. That's how long he's been around. So, that experience is just paramount, right? He's been on the field for so many of these big games. He's going to be older than a lot of the competition, and has some explosiveness and also some pass catching chops. Now, he doesn't have the same breakaway ability that Caden Durham or Caleb Jackson has, but he can give you something there. So I'm really excited to see Josh. And Grant, he's a walk-on, and I'm always going to cheer for the 2-star underdog stories, because there's just not really a whole lot of them at LSU.
He had a pretty awesome story, because he actually wasn't supposed to be walking. He was actually getting recruited by a good bit of schools, but he got injured his senior year, and then a lot of the schools dropped him. And then he just, instead of maybe going to a smaller school, said, I'm going to walk into LSU. And I think he's really paid off. He's been a pretty integral part of this LSU squad the last few years. So I'm glad to see him getting his flowers, especially for how long he's been here at LSU. He's basically a grandpa at this point. That's true. Yeah, he is. So that's one last question before I let you do your thing. I think, right now, I think LSU, it's the start of the transfer portal. You just saw Kai Preen leave for the transfer portal. Is it kind of concerning right now that LSU might lose some guys in the receiver room? I know it's probably not a big concern given how large this receiver room is and how talented this receiver room is, but is there sort of a concern that maybe there might be a few more names that come out of this receiver room that LSU may need to go in the transfer portal to get a few more?
No, it's actually a good thing for all parties involved. And I know that doesn't sound right, but here's the thing that people get wrong about wide receiver, right? So if you're a defensive back, you just want to play, right? You can't control the targets that are thrown your way or the tackles or where the offense is going to go. If you're a defensive back and you play, you're probably happy. Same thing for any defensive position. If you're getting snaps, you're happy. For wide receivers, they go to college because they want to go catch passes. So it's not enough if you just play or if you're a rotational piece. You want targets. You want at least 30, 40 targets, right? You don't want to play special teams. You don't want to be a returner. You want to go out there and catch the football. And there's only so many targets to go around. Targets are a very scarce resource. And guess what? Kai's probably going to go to Tulane or somewhere like that. and catch a lot of balls and actually get targets and actually play because he's a very good player. Grant, the hardest position to play in college football is wide receiver at LSU. It's just the deepest room, especially now with the portal and guys like C.J. Daniels and Xavier Thomas coming in. It is virtually impossible to play wide receiver at LSU unless you're really that dude. It is a true meritocracy. So it's hard, but it's honestly better because at the same time, the better LSU wide receiver rooms also were the tighter rotated wide receiver rooms. Jarvis Odell, they never left the field. Jets, Terrace, Jamar never left the field. Last year, Malik, Kyron, some Chris Hilton, and BTJ. That was it. Aaron Anderson played some, but that was practically it. And those are the best passing offenses we've seen at LSU. You go back to the Michael Clayton days. They didn't rotate a whole lot. So you want that rotation to be tighter, and Kai's going to go somewhere and play really well. And something else about wide receiver is, well, we've seen a lot of guys transfer from LSU and transfer from other elite Power 5 schools like Alabama, and they still get drafted and have really good NFL careers. I mean, Javon Baker is definitely one. He's a receiver at UCF, and he's about to get drafted, and he started his career at Alabama. Jameson Williams started his career at Alabama. Trey Quinn had a great NFL career. Tyron Johnson, the list goes on and on. So, wide receiver, I'm not too, concerned if anyone honestly leaves outside of like the top 5 guys. Where I think it'll be interesting is running back. There's going to be a lot of pressure on Caden Durham. Caden, for me, I do my own grades on every high school prospect. He is my number one offensive player. And I do think he's very good. I do think he can help you out immediately. But do you want to go get another running back so you don't have to, wait and see what happens with the Trey Holly situation? I think that would be something I would do to add to that room with Caleb and Josh.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point about the running back, and especially given the fact that LSU now has 2 running backs in the class of 2025, and they might even add a third because apparently they're trying to get James Simon still too, which is a pretty interesting dynamic. I'm kind of glad you mentioned that with Caden Durham, and that seems like there's going to be a lot of pressure on him to perform not only just this year, maybe not so much this year, but next year really too as well, because look, you're going to have 2 or 3 guys maybe coming in, so that's pretty that's going to be a pretty daunting task for him. But I also want to mention about the receivers that Kyron actually caught a 62-yard touchdown pass against LSU, and then 2 days later, boom, he's in the transfer portal. And as soon as that happened, Tulane's like, yeah, well, he might be the top target, which is pretty, which has been kind of a theme with Tulane. Like Tulane's been really aggressive when it comes to recruiting and the transfer portal. They seem to be getting guys that usually don't go to Tulane. So I'm kind of glad that the Green Wave are taking advantage of this. But really not even that. I was surprised of the 2 names I thought were going to mention the transfer portal. I thought it was going to be Sheldon Sampson that enters the transfer portal, given his pedigree coming out of high school, right?
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with Shelton because it was kind of a disappointing spring for him. He couldn't quite crack that first 2 deep. He was pretty much shut down in the spring game, and yeah, I hope he stays because he is a prodigious talent. But that's the thing. It's so like if he played any other position at LSU, he'd probably be, getting some reps. And that's why, some coaches have thought, hey, let's see if we could put a receiver at DB to see if it works. They've tried it. It's not worked out. But yeah, it's just that hard to play this position at LSU. And that should be the standard. The truth is, Grant, that should be true at defensive back too.
Right.
But it's not. Like, they're scraping and looking for defensive backs to emerge. That should be true at defensive tackle. You've had Glenn Dorsey, you had Ricky Jean Francois, you had all those great defensive tackle rooms. Marlon Favorite was in that room. So, it's tough. It's you wish it could be spread out a little bit more, but hopefully LSU is able to get some things done in the portal.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, Carter. You can follow Carter at Power Hour LSU on Twitter. He also has a YouTube channel, Power Hour LSU. I think it's one of the better LSU channels just because he actually breaks down, the game film. I think that was pretty interesting because
not many people really do that. We just talk about we give your opinions about the game, but you actually break it down. I think that's a pretty cool thing that a lot of people don't really kind of pay attention to, is to break everything down and really understand what's kind of going on. But anyway, thanks for joining me, Carter.
Yeah, everyone go check it out. Bryce Underwood was able to break down some of his high school or one of his high school throws that aren't on any of his high school reels. I had to really dig deep to find it. So I think you'll enjoy it. But Grant, I appreciate you. You'll never walk alone, my brother. I was only here to talk about Trent Alexander-Arnold, but LSU football will suffice, man. We'll talk soon, okay?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, man. But anyway, I also want to mention, I'll put that link for the Bryce Underwood story in the YouTube link.
Yeah,
on the bottom. Yep, I'll make sure to put it on because I thought that was pretty interesting as well. But anyway, thanks, Carter.
How about cheers?
So yeah, there's that. So that's the end of the show today. I'll also tomorrow we'll discuss LSU baseball, what's going on there. We'll recap the Pelicans game. We'll probably talk a little bit more football. Like maybe we talk about the depth chart going in. It's kind of a slow news week for Louisiana sports just because of there's a Tulane spring game, so we might talk about that as well. But it's a pretty slow sports week in Louisiana, and we're kind of getting to the dead period in Louisiana, as you know. Louisiana doesn't really necessarily have a major league sports team, but the draft is coming up next week, so that'll be very interesting. But we're starting a very slow period in Louisiana sports. But with that being said, my name is Grant Chachere. I'm the host of the South Podcast here at Ruger Sports Media. Make sure to follow Ruger Sports Media wherever you get your social media, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And then also make sure to like this video and subscribe to get the latest updates for any video that may come your way, whether it's game highlights, whether it's podcasts, whether it's press conferences. We have a lot of good stuff. So just stay tuned, and we'll see y'all later. Peace, y'all.